There is a particular quality to summer in Boyd County, Kentucky, that anyone who has lived there will recognize in their bones. It is not merely heat. The word heat is too clean, too simple. It suggests something that can be measured on a thermometer and left on a table. This is something else. This is the air itself turned liquid, pressing down on every surface, soaking through cotton shirts within minutes, turning the hills behind town into slow-breathing creatures shimmering under a white July sky. By 7 in the morning, you are already damp. By noon, the tar on Route 23 goes soft. By 3 in the afternoon, the Ohio River, wide and brown and indifferent, gives off a smell that is half mud and half metal and half something older, something that has been sitting in those banks since before the first settlers named this land. This is where our story lives, in that heat, in that smell. Ashland, Kentucky, in the summer of 1987, was a town caught between two worlds. The steel mills that had defined its character for decades were slowing, some already closed, their stacks gone quiet, their parking lots empty on Monday mornings. The men who worked them were adapting, or not. There were still company picnics and church socials and 4th of July fireworks over the river, but underneath the summer rituals there was something quieter, a murmur of uncertainty, a sense that the ground was shifting even when it was standing still. Children, as they tend to do, ignored all of this. The summer of 1987 was, to the boys who lived it, a season of baseball cards and swimming holes, and the particular luxury of days without schedule. School felt impossibly far away. The future was something that happened to adults. What mattered was right now, the next bend in the trail, the next creek crossing, the next can of Orange Crush sweating in a cooler on somebody's back porch. It was into this world that 4 boys were born, and from this world that 4 boys would, on a single Thursday afternoon in late July, vanish. Tommy Hensley was 13 years old, and he was the kind of boy who walked into a room like he already knew what was going to happen. Not arrogant. That's not quite the right word. Confident is closer, but still incomplete. Tommy had a quality that his mother Linda described in the months and years after his disappearance as forward-leaning. He moved toward things rather than away from them. He was the first to jump from the rope swing at Granger's Creek, the first to propose an idea, the first to say yes. He was also, by the summer of 1987, acutely aware that time was running out. His father had accepted a transfer to a plant in Huntington, West Virginia, not far, geographically, but a world away, in the logic of 13-year-old friendship. The family was moving at the end of August. This last summer was, in Tommy's mind, a countdown. Every bike ride, every sleepover, every expedition into the hills behind town was charged with a significance he couldn't quite name. He knew only that he wanted to make it count. Jake Porter was 12, quiet in the way that still water is quiet, not empty, but deep. His teachers described him as a thinker and self-contained, which in 1987 in Boyd County was their way of saying that he didn't feel the need to announce himself. Jake read more than the other boys. He kept a journal that his mother, Patrice, described as mostly drawings. Maps, really. He loved making maps. He was loyal in the specific, unsentimental way of boys who don't say what they mean but show up regardless. When Tommy Hensley needed someone, Jake was there. Mark Dalton was 12, and he was the one who remembered to bring the extra batteries. He was the son of a machinist, pragmatic in the way that children absorb the values of their parents without knowing it. He packed carefully. He checked the weather. He was the one who, on previous camping trips, had thought to bring the waterproof matches and the extra rope. The other boys teased him about it, gently, affectionately, and he accepted the teasing with the equanimity of someone who knows he is right. His mother, Doreen, would later say that Mark never left the house without telling her exactly where he was going. He was reliable that way, she said in a 1988 interview. Her voice entirely level in the way that people's voices go level when they've decided they will not cry again. He was always reliable. Ricky Cole was 11, the youngest, and he knew it. He understood, with the particular sensitivity of youngest children everywhere, that his place in the group was provisional, that he was included out of something between affection and obligation, and that this was not cruelty but simply the truth of being 11 in a group of 12 and 13-year-olds. He compensated by being enthusiastic, by saying yes to everything, by trailing a step behind and being grateful for the view. His mother, Carol, said he used to practice his whistle on the back step every morning that summer. He was teaching himself to bird call, she said. He had this little library book. He wanted to impress the older boys. These were the four: Tommy, who leaned forward; Jake, who thought deeply; Mark, who planned carefully; and Ricky, who followed gladly. They had been friends in the overlapping, complicated way of small-town boys. Some friendships older than others, some forged in different grades or neighborhoods, all of them woven together by the geography of a town small enough that you couldn't avoid someone even if you wanted to. July 23, 1987 was a Thursday. The temperature hit 94 degrees by noon and stayed there. The sweet smell of honeysuckle was everywhere that summer. It grew wild along the fence lines and at the edges of the woods. A perfume so heavy it was almost dizzying, and on a still afternoon it could stop you in your tracks. The boys had been planning the trip for a week. Tommy had found a topographic map in his father's study, a 1987 Boyd County trail map printed by the State Forestry Division, showing the network of hiking paths through the hills south of town. He had identified what the map called a Southern Spur Trail, a route that angled away from the main Colton Ridge path and descended into a basin the locals called Hollerbend. The map showed the trail clearly, a dotted line, confident and definitive, curving south through the trees. Tommy showed the map to the others and said simply, "We've never been that far." He didn't need to say anything else. They packed away 13-year-old boys packed for adventure, with enthusiasm and imperfect judgment. Tommy's backpack contained a flashlight, a Swiss Army knife, a box of Little Debbie snack cakes, and the folded map. Jake brought his journal and a compass he'd gotten for Christmas. Mark brought rope, extra batteries, a first aid kit the size of a makeup bag, and 3 cans of Vienna sausages that he considered essential survival food. Ricky brought his bird call library book, a pack of juicy fruit, and a single Polaroid camera, the kind that spits out the photograph immediately, still wet, the image appearing in slow motion from white to color. A neighbor, Sandra Pruitt, who lives 2 houses down from the Hensley place on Maple Creek Drive, later told investigators that she had seen the boys loading their backpacks on the front lawn at around noon. They were laughing about something, she said. Tommy was doing something with the compass, holding it up like he was a sea captain. The younger one, Ricky, he kept dropping his book and picking it up. She did not think to ask where they were going. It was summer. Boys went places. At approximately 5:00 in the afternoon, the 4 boys were seen for the last time. A man named Gerald Trout, out walking his beagle along the Colton Road, spotted them at the base of the path that climbed toward the Colton Fire Tower. He later told investigators that he remembered them clearly because they had waved at him. All 4 of them, in a loose group, backpacks on, bikes leaned against a fence post. They looked fine, Trout said, happy even. I remember thinking those boys are going to be out past dark. He had thought to call after them, something cautionary, the instinct of a middle-aged man seeing children headed for the hills at 5 in the afternoon. But the beagle pulled at the leash and the boys were already moving, and he let the moment pass. He has spoken about that moment in several subsequent interviews. He has never stopped speaking about it. The transition from concern to panic does not happen all at once. It creeps in. On the evening of July 23rd, Linda Hensley expected Tommy home by dark. When dark came and he hadn't arrived, she told herself he was at Jake's. She called the Porter house. Patrice Porter said Jake wasn't home either. Both women told themselves the same thing. They must be at Mark's. Doreen Dalton said no, they hadn't been there. Carol Cole said the same. It was 10:30 at night and 4 mothers were on the phone with each other, and the thing that none of them said out loud was moving through the silence between their words. By midnight, they had called the fathers, the neighbors, the older siblings. Someone drove the Colton Road with the car windows down, calling names into the dark. The hills called nothing back. At 2 in the morning, Linda Hensley made the call to the Boyd County Sheriff's Department. The deputy who answered would later say that her voice, even then, was calm. She was very precise, he said. She told me their names, their ages, what they were wearing, where they were last seen. She didn't cry. She told me everything I needed to know. He paused in the interview. That kind of calm scares you more than crying does. By 3 in the morning, the porches on Maple Creek Drive were lit up, and the flashlight beams were cutting across lawns and down alleys, and the summer night had turned into something else entirely. The cicadas kept singing. They didn't know the difference. The search that began on the morning of July 24, 1987, would become the largest organized rescue operation in Boyd County history. Within 48 hours, more than 300 volunteers had assembled at the Colton Road trailhead, men from the fire departments of 3 counties, a National Guard unit out of Moorhead, search and rescue teams from as far away as Lexington, helicopters, 2 of them, chopped back and forth across the ridgeline, their shadows sliding over the tree canopy like slow hands sweeping a table. The command post was established in the gravel parking lot at the base of Colton Road, in the shadow of a Baptist church whose congregation had shown up en masse to provide food and support. They brought enough fried chicken to feed an army, and they very nearly had an army to feed. Long folding tables were set up end to end, covered with aluminum trays. The smell of coffee, thick, institutional, burnt at the edges from too long on too hot burners, mixed with the honeysuckle in the morning dew and the exhaust from the generator that kept the radio equipment running. Linda Hensley stood at the edge of the command post from dawn. She didn't sit. She told volunteers her son's shoe size, his allergies, none, the exact flashlight he was carrying, a 3-battery maglite, black, with a small dent in the barrel from when he dropped it on concrete. She distributed photocopied flyers. She answered every question twice. She was operating on something beyond adrenaline, something closer to pure, focused will, the human animal at its most disciplined, refusing to feel anything that would slow her down. The search teams moved into the hills in grids. Each team had a radio, a compass, and a section of trail to cover. They called the boys names. The hills in that part of Kentucky are not gentle. The terrain is broken, the creek beds steep, the undergrowth thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel that can swallow a trail whole. Progress was slow. By afternoon of the first day, they had covered the main Colton Ridge Trail and the fire tower vicinity with no results. On the second day, the bloodhound teams arrived. 3 dogs, worked by handlers from the State Forestry Service. They were given the boys' clothing, Tommy's baseball jersey, Jake's worn-out sneakers, and released at the trailhead. The dogs moved with conviction, angling south along the main trail for the first quarter mile, then pulling east toward a section of the ridge that the search teams had not yet reached. One handler, a quiet man named Vernon Bates, would give the detail that resonated most in subsequent years. His dog, a veteran female named Duchess, led him to the edge of an old gully, a shallow depression in the hillside partially filled with recent erosion debris, and then went wild. Duchess circled the gully 3 times, barking with an urgency that Bates had learned to read as serious. The other dogs came and showed the same behavior. Then, abruptly, they stopped. It was like someone turned a switch, Bates said in a 2016 interview, after the case was finally resolved. They were frantic, and then they sat down, which sometimes means the scent dispersed or the wind shifted. We dug in that gully for 4 hours. We found mud. He paused. We found a lot of mud. Brand new mud, fresh from the rain. What no one understood in 1987, what would take geologists 28 years to reconstruct, was that the gully Duchess circled so frantically was not where the boys had walked. It was where they were buried. On the evening of July 25th, the 3rd day of the search, a massive thunderstorm rolled in from the west. It arrived without adequate warning. The weather forecasts had mentioned the possibility of showers, the genteel meteorological language that does not convey what actually happened. What happened was this. In the space of 4 hours, more than 5 inches of rain fell on the Colton Ridge watershed. The searchers retreated from the hills. They had to. The trails became rivers within the first hour, rushing with red clay water that eroded the path edges and filled the creek beds to overflowing. Lightning struck the ridge multiple times. The command post, already damp, became a lake of mud around the generator's feet. The helicopters were grounded. The dogs were pulled. The night was given over to the storm, and the storm took everything it was offered. The thing about the Hollerben Basin, the geological formation that sits at the southern end of the Colton Ridge Trail system, is that it was designed by nature to trap water. The basin is formed by 2 intersecting limestone ridges that angle toward each other like cupped hands, creating a catchment zone that fills rapidly in heavy rain. The limestone itself is old, Devonian-era rock, riddled with fractures and sinkholes, and under heavy rainfall, the thin layer of soil above it becomes supersaturated almost instantly. When soil that is already holding as much water as it can hold receives more water, it does not absorb it. It moves. The Hollerben Basin has a geological record of small-scale landslides going back at least 200 years, evidence preserved in the stratigraphy of the basin floor, in the layered deposits of soil and rock that tell the story of a hillside rearranging itself over and over. The locals knew the basin was prone to slides. There is, in the oral history of Boyd County, reference to a 1923 event in which a section of the south-facing slope collapsed after 3 days of rain, but that knowledge was community knowledge, the kind that lives in conversations in old newspapers, not in official records or trail maps. On the night of July 25, 1987, the south slope of the Hollabin Basin moved. A section of hillside approximately 40 feet wide and 12 feet deep detached along a clay seam and slid downward, carrying trees, brush, and limestone fragments with it. It happened quickly. These things usually do. The geological reconstruction, completed in 2015, estimated the event took less than 90 seconds from initiation to rest. In those 90 seconds, the storm accomplished what 28 years of searching could not undo. The search resumed after the storm, but it was searching a different landscape. The trails had been altered. New gullies had appeared where there had been solid ground. Familiar landmarks had been rearranged. The teams worked through the mud and heat of late July, following leads that led nowhere. There was the rumor of a hermit, a man the locals called Old Caulfield. His real name was Howard Caulfield, a reclusive Vietnam veteran who had been living in a small cabin in the hills south of town for several years. Sheriff's deputies visited him twice. He was cooperative, if taciturn, allowed them to search his property, and denied any knowledge of the boys. The searches found nothing, but rumors are harder to kill than facts, and in the absence of resolution, the story of Old Caulfield grew and changed and spread through town, in the way that explanations always fill a vacuum. There were reported sightings, a man who thought he'd seen 4 boys near the Canova Bridge, a woman who thought she'd heard children's voices from the hills above her house on the night of the 24th. Each lead was followed, none of them connected to anything real. Slowly through August, the searches became smaller. The National Guard units rotated out. The volunteers from other counties stopped coming. The folding tables were packed up. The command post contracted to a single trailer, manned by 2 deputies and a radio. The fried chicken was no longer replenished. In August, after 6 weeks of searching, the organized effort was officially scaled back. The case remained open, officially, but officially open is different from actively pursued, and everyone in town knew the difference. When people cannot explain something, they reach for the oldest explanatory tools available. In a town like Ashland in 1987, those tools included faith and superstition, and the particular local mythology that accumulates in any community that has stood long enough in one place to generate its own folklore. The Colton Woods curse did not exist before the summer of 1987, but it existed afterward. It grew from a combination of things: the town's memory of other tragedies in those hills, the inexplicability of 4 boys vanishing so completely, and the human need to give suffering a cause that is larger than accident. People said the woods had always been wrong, that animals avoided the southern ridge, that compasses behaved strangely near the Hollabin Basin. None of this was true, but truth is not the point of a curse. The point of a curse is to give grief somewhere to put its anger, to say something intended this, something meant for it to happen, because the alternative, that 4 boys walked into the hills on a beautiful July day and were simply randomly, silently erased, is a thing that the human mind resists with everything it has. Every year, on July 23rd, Linda Hensley drove the Colton Road to the ridge. She had done it for the first time in 1988, 1 year after Tommy disappeared. She had driven up in the early morning, before the heat built, and walked to a flat-top stump at the edge of the main trail. A stump she and Tommy had used as a picnic table during shorter hikes when he was younger. She had set 4 toy soldiers on the stump, 1 for each of the boys. Then she had driven home and gone back to work. She did this every year for 27 years. The ritual changed slightly over time. Some years she brought flowers as well. Some years she sat on the ground next to the stump for a while before driving away. The toy soldiers were the same every year. The same brand, the same poses, one kneeling with a rifle, one standing with a hand raised. She bought them from the same dollar store on Winchester Avenue, which sold them in packs of 20, until the dollar store closed in 2009, at which point she found a new source online and ordered them in bulk. Her daughter Melissa, who was 15 when Tommy disappeared and is now a nurse practitioner in Huntington, has said that the ritual was never discussed, not planned or announced or explained. It simply happened the way breathing happens. She'd be up early that day, Melissa said in a 2016 interview. She'd have her coffee, she'd be quiet, and then she'd go. We learned not to try to come with her. Linda Hensley is a private woman. She gave very few interviews in the years after Tommy disappeared, and those she gave were brief and factual, not emotional. She did not want to be a symbol. She did not want to be photographed at the stump. She went, and she placed the soldiers, and she came home. What passed between her and those trees on those mornings is her own. I kept going, she said in a rare 2015 interview, filmed before she knew what was about to be found, because I knew he was there. I didn't know where, but I knew he hadn't gone far. A mother knows. She paused. He's not lost. I've never believed he was lost. He's somewhere I haven't found yet. Harold Vickers had been a deputy in Boyd County for 11 years when the boys disappeared. He was 34 years old, recently married, and still in the phase of his career when he believed that if you worked hard enough and thought clearly enough, things resolved. Cases closed. Answers came. The Ashland boys case was the one that dismantled that belief. Not immediately. It took years. But it dismantled it thoroughly. By the time Harold Vickers retired from the Boyd County Sheriff's Department in 2004, at the age of 51, he had accumulated more than 200 hours of personal time on the case. Time spent outside his official duties on his own, following threads that department resources couldn't justify pursuing. His wife, Margene, described his garage as the office that never slept. The walls were covered in topographic maps of the Colton Ridge Trail system, marked in red ink. Red dots where volunteers had searched. Red circles around areas Harold thought had been inadequately covered. Red annotations in his small, precise handwriting noting elevations and drainage patterns, and the locations of the 1987 Bloodhound reports. He had, by 2004, become certain of one thing. The boys had gone farther south than anyone had searched. His reasoning was methodical. He had overlaid the Bloodhound routes from 1987 with topographic data and noted that the dogs had consistently pulled south before their handlers redirected them to areas already mapped as search priority. He had spoken with Vernon Bates, the handler whose dog had circled the gully, and had become convinced that the gully was significant. He had driven up there alone in his civilian car more times than he could count, and stood at the edge of the depression trying to understand what it was trying to tell him. On winter evenings when the garage got cold and Margene brought him coffee without being asked, Harold would sit at the folding table under the fluorescent light and go through his notes. His thinking, reconstructed from the journals he kept during this period, went something like this. They were not foolish kids. Tommy Hensley had a map. He had a compass. He had a friend who knew how to use a compass. The map told them there was a trail. The trail was on paper. You trust what's on paper. That's what maps are for. So they followed the dotted line south. They followed it right into the basin. And then the storm came. The question that haunted Harold Vickers for 28 years was not where the boys went. He believed, with increasing certainty as the years passed, that he knew where they went. The question was, what happened when they got there, and what the land had done with them afterward. I used to go up there at the end of summer, he told a journalist in 2016. After the leaves came down and you could see the shapes of things better, I'd stand at the edge of that gully and think, they're close. They've been close the whole time. We just couldn't see them. He was right. He was right about everything except the exact spot. He had marked it on his map with a red circle and written next to it, in his small, careful handwriting, look here again. Soil disturbed. Old. Check after dry season. The circle was 400 yards from where the tin would be found. In the spring of 2008, a paralegal in Lexington named David Arnett, browsing a police property auction website on a slow Friday afternoon, found a listing that stopped him cold. It was a lot of unclaimed evidence items from various Kentucky jurisdictions, the kind of miscellaneous accumulation that property rooms generate over decades. Most of the items were unremarkable. One was not. Item 114B, one canvas backpack, olive green, youth size. Initials TH, written in black permanent marker on inside flap. Boyd County, MISC undated evidence. Starting bid $5. Arnett had grown up in Ashland. He knew the story. He called the Boyd County Sheriff's Department that afternoon. The The backpack had been collected in the early weeks of the 1987 search, found near the Colton trailhead, logged as possible evidence, and then misfiled in a system update in 1993. For 15 years it had sat in a labeled box in a property room, processed out as unclaimed goods when a new evidence management protocol was implemented. The contents, when analyzed, were heartbreaking in their ordinariness. 2 packets of Little Debbie snack cakes, one empty, one unopened. A balled-up paper bag. A broken pencil. The backpack's fabric had preserved enough trace evidence to confirm that it was consistent with Tommy Hensley's belongings. But it told investigators nothing they didn't already know. Tommy had been at the trailhead. Tommy had brought snacks. Tommy had gone into the hills. Linda Hensley, contacted by investigators, said nothing for a long time when she was told. Then she said, "He always did love those things. I used to buy them by the case." The backpack now sits in the Boyd County Historical Society's collection. They keep it in an acid-free box with Tommy's name on a small card next to it. You have to ask to see it. Most people don't ask. Daniel Merritt had been hiking the Colton Ridge Trail system for most of his adult life. He was 42 years old in the summer of 2015, a high school science teacher from Huntington, who spent his weekends in the hills with a camera and a geological survey interest that had never quite formalized into a credential, but had accumulated into genuine knowledge. He knew the trails. He knew the terrain. He knew the way the limestone surfaced in certain places after rain, bright and fresh-looking against the older weathered rock, the way a wound exposes new skin at its center. On September 14, 2015, he was exploring a section of the ridge he'd always called the Limestone Cut, a narrow passage where the trail ran between 2 exposed faces of Devonian limestone, the stone laid in horizontal layers like the pages of an enormous book. He had been there before, but after the previous winter, which had brought unusually heavy freeze-thaw cycles to the region, the face of the southern wall had changed. A new section had fractured and shifted, exposing several feet of pale, previously hidden stone. "It looked like someone had cut through a birthday cake," Merritt said in a 2015 interview. "That fresh limestone is a completely different color, almost white, almost chalky. It stands out against the weathered gray of the old surface." He had taken photographs of the exposed face, noting the horizontal fracture lines and thinking about the freeze-thaw mechanism that had caused the split. Then he saw the tin. It was wedged in a natural crevice, where the old rock met the new fracture, a space created by the winter's movement, where 2 layers of stone had separated slightly, leaving a gap perhaps 3 inches wide and a foot deep. The tin was small, roughly the size of a tobacco tin or a first aid kit, heavily rusted, its lid sealed by years of oxidation and the pressure of the surrounding rock. A rusted wire had been wound around it twice and twisted into a rough knot. Merritt did not open it on the trail. He almost did. His hands were on the wire for a moment, and then he stopped himself. Some instinct that he has described as "not quite sure what I was afraid of," making him careful. He put the tin in his pack, intact, and hiked back to his car. He drove to the Boyd County Sheriff's Department and handed it across the counter to a deputy, explaining where he had found it. The deputy's name was Angela Harlow. She was 29 years old and had been with the department for 4 years. She did not immediately connect the tin to the 1987 case. That connection came later, when the investigators opened the rusted lid in a controlled environment and found what was inside. The tin was opened the following morning in a room with gloved hands and a camera recording. The lid came away with effort. It had essentially fused to the body of the tin through decades of oxidation, and inside, sealed by the same process that had preserved them, were 3 items. The first was a small notebook, the kind with a cardboard cover and lined pages, the sort sold in school supply sections for 39 cents. The cover was largely illegible, the cardboard having absorbed enough moisture over 28 years to collapse into a compressed mass, but the interior pages, protected by the tin and by the pressure of the surrounding items, had survived in a state that forensic conservators would later describe as remarkable. The pages were fused together, yellowed, fragile as old skin, but present, intact, containing something. The second item was a Polaroid photograph, bleached by time to a faded palette. The color drained, the contrast reduced, the image, ghostly but legible. It showed 4 boys standing in front of a wooden sign. The sign read, "END of Trail." The boys were smiling. They were posed. Tommy in the center, arms slung around the shoulders of Jake and Mark on either side, with Ricky slightly to the right, laughing at something outside the frame. Their backpacks were on. The sun was bright in the photograph, the kind of direct midday light that comes from an open sky. A summer sky, before a storm. The third item was a single folded piece of paper, separate from the notebook. A note written on ruled paper in the deliberate, careful handwriting of a boy trying to be legible under difficult circumstances. The investigators read the note 3 times before anyone spoke. It said, "We went down the wrong ridge. Jake's compass got wet, and I don't think it's working right anymore. We found a sign that said end of trail, and we took a picture. We thought it was funny then. We're in a low place between 2 hills. There's water coming in from somewhere. Mark's hurt. His ankle. He twisted it bad on the rocks. The sun is gone and I don't know which direction to walk. It's raining really hard now. I can hear thunder up on the ridge." Then, in larger, slower letters, as though the writer had paused and resumed with a different kind of intention. "If you find this, tell our moms we stayed together. We're scared but we're not mad. We stayed together." The note was signed at the bottom with 4 names in 4 different handwritings. Tommy, Jake, Mark, Ricky. Ricky's handwriting, the youngest boy, the shadow who followed gladly, was the most careful of the 4. Each letter formed with deliberate effort. His name, at the bottom of the note, is the most legible thing on the page. The excavation of the Hollabin Basin site took 11 days. Geologists and forensic archaeologists worked in careful layers, documenting each strata of soil and rock before removing it. What they found was consistent with a rapid deposition event. The hallmarks of a landslide, the mixed and compressed layers of soil and stone that indicate material moved quickly and settled under its own weight. At a depth of approximately 6 feet, beneath the debris of the 1987 slide, they found the 4 boys. They were, as the note had promised, together. The skeletal remains, analyzed by a forensic anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, indicated that the 4 boys had been in close proximity at the time of the slide, the positioning consistent with a group of individuals huddled together, possibly sheltering against the rain or the hillside. There was no evidence of trauma predating the landslide. The cause of death for all 4 was determined to be sudden burial consistent with a slope failure event. They had not suffered. The geologist on the case, Dr. Patricia Mead, explained in her report that a slide of that magnitude and speed would have been instantaneous in its effect. "They would have been there," she said carefully in a press conference, "and then the hill would have come, and that would have been the end of it." She paused. They were together. That was the last thing they chose, and they got to keep it. Then Hensley told of the discovery, sat with the news for a long moment. Then she said quietly, the 4 words that became the headline, "He's not lost anymore. He's home." The notebook went to the Document Conservation Laboratory at the University of Kentucky's Special Collections Division, where conservators had spent careers developing techniques for recovering text from damaged paper. The process of separating 28 years of fused pages is not fast. And it is not simple, and it requires a discipline that is essentially the opposite of urgency, an almost meditative patience applied to an object that the entire world seems to be holding its breath about. The conservators began by humidifying the notebook, introducing controlled moisture to relax the fused pages without causing further damage. This is done in a chamber that maintains precise humidity levels, the paper absorbing the moisture in millimeter increments over the course of hours. Then, using instruments that looked like surgical tools designed for a surgery performed in slow motion, they began separating the pages one at a time. Most of what they recovered was what you would expect from a 12-year-old boy's journal. Drawings, some of them careful, some of them not. A hand-drawn map. Jake's version of the trail, remarkably accurate in its depiction of the first portion of the route and increasingly speculative as it approached the Hollabin Basin. Notes in his careful, precise handwriting, documenting the day's progress in the language of someone who had read enough adventure novels to know how expedition journals were supposed to sound. The time they left the trailhead, the height of the fire tower estimated, the direction of the wind, and on the last legible page of the journal, the page closest to the note, folded separately and placed on top, the conservators found something that required a different kind of light to see. Infrared imaging has been used in document analysis for decades. It is one of the standard tools in the Conservation Laboratory's arsenal, deployed routinely to read text obscured by water damage, by overwriting, by the deterioration of certain inks. The The principle is straightforward. Different materials absorb and reflect light differently at different wavelengths. The human eye sees only the narrow band of wavelengths we call visible light. Infrared imaging extends that range, capturing wavelengths that our eyes cannot detect, and in doing so can reveal text that is invisible to direct examination. The conservators of the University of Kentucky used a modified multispectral imaging setup, a camera system capable of capturing images across a range of wavelengths from visible light through the near-infrared spectrum. They worked systematically through the recovered pages, imaging each one at multiple wavelengths and comparing the results. On the final page of the notebook, visible light imaging showed almost nothing. The page appeared blank, or rather, it appeared stained and discolored in ways that suggested attempted writing, but no text was legible. The conservator who first examined it, a specialist named Dr. Carol Ann Fitch, noted in her lab records that the page showed possible trace of pencil or graphite medium, heavily obscured by moisture damage and ferric compound staining. She imaged it in infrared. The lab was quiet when the image came up on the monitor. Dr. Fitch has described the moment in several interviews, always with the same careful understatement of a scientist trying not to oversell a result that needs no selling. The contrast shifted, she said. In infrared, the staining becomes more transparent and the graphite becomes more distinct. And there it was, 4 words. The words rendered in a child's handwriting, small and effortful, written in graphite pencil at the lowest pressure end of what a child's hand can produce. The writing of someone whose hand is cold or wet or shaking. W.E. See flashes twelve the tears. The analysis of the graphite pressure, the page's position in the notebook sequence, and the forensic reconstruction of the events of July 25th all pointed to the same conclusion. This line was written shortly before the landslide. It was written by a boy looking up through the trees at the lightning moving across the ridge above them. It was the last thing recorded. Jake Porter. Quiet, thoughtful, loyal. He had kept his journal to the end. The 1987 Boyd County Forestry Trail map that Tommy Hensley had brought into the hills was recovered among the items in the tin, folded and refolded, heavily water damaged, but with enough legibility to be analyzed. The analysis confirmed what Harold Vickers had suspected for 28 years, and what the geological reconstruction of the site made undeniable. The Southern Spur Trail shown on the map was not a functional trail in 1987. It had not been a functional trail for several years prior to 1987. The trail had been created by a logging operation in the early 1970s, cleared for equipment access to a timber stand on the south slope. When the logging operation ended, the trail was left unmaintained. By the early 1980s, it had been partially reclaimed by vegetation. By 1984 or 1985, according to Forestry Department records recovered in 2015, it had been officially delisted from the active trail network. However, and this is the detail that carries the full weight of 28 years of grief, the map that showed the trail had continued to be distributed without revision. The 1987 printing of the Boyd County Trail map still showed the Southern Spur as a usable trail, its dotted line confident and definitive, pointing south toward the Hollerman Basin. The boys had followed a trail that existed on paper but not in reality. They had done exactly what the map told them to do. They had been competent, prepared, and methodical. They had simply been given wrong information. Dr. Mead, the geologist, put it plainly in the press conference that followed the map analysis. These boys did everything right, she said. They packed appropriately. They told people they were going out. They brought a compass and a map. The map was wrong. That's the whole story. The map was wrong. Sheriff Dale Combs stood at the podium for a long moment after the forensic reports had been summarized. Then he said the sentence that would be quoted in every subsequent account of the case. They didn't get lost. We lost them. He said it simply without elaboration and stepped away from the podium. There was silence in the room for a full 3 seconds before anyone moved. What the science tells us, the complete forensic picture, assembled across 6 months of analysis, tells a story that is both tragic and, in the strange, cold comfort that facts can sometimes provide, comprehensible. On the afternoon of July 23, 1987, the 4 boys entered the Colton Ridge Trail system in good spirits and in good order. They reached the fire tower and continued south following the main trail. At some point in the late afternoon, they reached the point where the Southern Spur was indicated on their map and turned south along it. The southern spur, by 1987, was not a trail. It was a corridor of slightly thinner vegetation, the residual ghost of the logging access road, recognizable to trained eyes as a former path but not readily distinguishable from the surrounding forest to four boys with a map that told them it was still there. They followed it south. The terrain became rougher. The map, as Jake's journal notes indicate, was not matching what they saw. They made adjustments as hikers do. They pressed on. At some point on the afternoon of July 23rd, Mark Dalton twisted his ankle on the rocky descent into the Holopan Basin. Jake's journal mentions this at what appears to be mid-afternoon. They stopped. They took the photograph at the end of trail sign, a forestry marker at the base of the old logging road, indicating the southern terminus of what had once been the access route. The photograph shows the sun still high and bright. They had expected to find a trail that continued. They found a sign that said it ended. They made shelter in the basin. They intended to wait out the night and navigate back in the morning. They had food. They had flashlights. They had the steady pragmatism of Mark Dalton and the thoughtful leadership of Tommy Hensley. Then, on the night of July 25th, the storm arrived. Jake wrote in his journal as long as he could. He wrote the last 4 words in pencil, barely pressing, on a page that the rain had already begun to compromise. He set the journal in the tin with the note they had written together, wound the wire around it, and put it in the crevice. He was 12 years old. He was thinking about whoever would come looking. 90 seconds later, the hillside moved. The dogs that arrived 2 days after that, circling the gully and then sitting down in confusion. They were not confused by absence. They were confused by depth. The boys were there. They had been there the whole time. The land had simply rearranged itself around them, the way the land does when it has had enough of its shape and decides to become something different. Conclusion. The light that remained the memorial service for Tommy Hensley, Jake Porter, Mark Dalton, and Ricky Cole was held on a Saturday in October 2015 at the Boyd County Fairgrounds. Because no church in Ashland was large enough, more than 2,000 people came. Some of them had been at the command post in 1987, pouring coffee and praying and refusing to go home. Some of them were too young to remember 1987, but had grown up with the story, the way small towns grow up with their particular griefs. Some of them had driven from other counties, other states, drawn by the news coverage, by the photographs of 4 boys in a faded Polaroid, by the words on a note that had spread across the country in the weeks after the discovery. We're scared, but we're not mad. We stayed together. Linda Hensley sat in the front row. She did not cry during the service, or at least not publicly. Her daughter Melissa sat beside her, and Harold Vickers, retired 8 years but present, in a sport coat that did not quite fit anymore, sat 2 rows back and watched her shoulders. When the service ended and people filed out into the October afternoon, the light was the particular golden light of Kentucky fall, low and sidelong and warm in a way that October light has no business being warm. The hills were visible in the distance, the Colton Ridge dark green against a pale sky. Harold Vickers drove home and went into his garage. He took down the maps one by one and rolled them carefully and set them in a storage tube. He took the red pen from the desk and looked at it for a moment, then placed it in a drawer. The garage had been his office for 28 years. He stood in it for a while, in the quiet, and then he turned off the fluorescent light and went inside. In the spring of 2016, the Boyd County Parks Department reopened a section of the Colton Ridge Trail system. They had built a new path, well-graded, well-marked, following a route confirmed to be stable and navigable. They named it 4 Pines Path, after 4 pine trees that stood at the trailhead, marking the entrance the way sentinels mark a gate. At the dedication ceremony, which was small and quiet by design, they lit 4 lanterns and hung them from the trees at the head of the trail. Solar-powered, motion-activated. They come on at dusk and go off at dawn. Hikers who use the trail in the evening see them first from a distance, through the trees, a soft, warm light against the darkening sky. Some of them stop and look, the way you stop when you see a light in a window and feel, for a moment, the comfort of it. Linda Hensley went to the Colton Road on July 23, 2016. She had the 4 toy soldiers in her coat pocket. She walked to the flat-topped stump at the edge of the trail and set them down, one by one in their familiar arrangement. One kneeling, one standing, one with a hand raised. Then she picked them up again. All 4 of them. She put them in her pocket and walked back to her car. She didn't need to leave them anymore. W.E. See flashes through the tears. We're scared, but we're not mad. We stayed together.